Good afternoon, and welcome to this third seminar in the Barbados Town Planning Society series on revitalising Bridgetown. Today, we're looking at a housing focus and how housing, redevelopment of housing, new development of housing can help revitalise Bridgetown. My name is Kim Penfold. I'm currently the Barbados Town Planning Society Secretary. I'm a planner. And I have to admit to having a special interest in this topic because for 20 or 30 years I worked in the UK doing a job for the not-for-profit housing sector, which often involved housing-led regeneration schemes. My role today, though, is to introduce the topic and introduce the speakers. And we're looking at what housing can do to contribute to the revitalisation of Bridgetown. The key questions that we're looking at are probably what sort of housing are we talking about? Who wants to live in Bridgetown? Is it economically viable? How would it affect the existing residents of Bridgetown if there were more people moving in? What needs to be done to make it happen? We're talking about the possibilities, we're talking about the barriers, and we're talking about potential solutions. We're starting from a position in Bridgetown where there's actually a very small resident population. And we can contrast that with some cities around the world where the city centres have large numbers of people in them. Big example from Europe is Barcelona, fabulous city, lively because people live in the middle. People visit Barcelona, it's one of the most visited cities in Europe, largely because the visitors see people going about their lives, doing their business and enjoying themselves, and they can feel part of that life. A bit like Bridgetown, Barcelona actually has a beach right in the middle of the city. And closer to home, we have Havana. Havana is the Caribbean's metropolitan city. It's actually twice the size of Barcelona. And the population living right in the middle of the old town makes it lively and active, day and night. There are the artists, the performers, people with ordinary jobs, they all live upstairs from the cafes and the restaurants, the galleries and the shops downstairs. It's a living city and it works. So those are two examples of cities where people have actually lived always. They've never lost their population. But it is possible for cities to bring people back. And I've got an example of that myself in Manchester. And I lived in Manchester or near Manchester for 30 odd years. And when I first moved there, the city had been going through a major decline in the 60s and 70s. And by the early 1980s, there were only 1,000 people at most living in the central wards of the city. But that changed. In 2019, that figure had risen to 65,200. It had gone up 19,000 since 2004. And between 2018 and 2019, the number actually increased by 5,000. Now, this was deliberate. It was policy driven by the city council. They wanted to bring people back into the centre. They saw it as a way to get the economy moving. They wanted to attract new businesses in growth sectors, finance, technology, the creative sectors. The sorts of developments that they brought in were a mixture, private rented sector and housing for sale. There was also some social housing. One of the things they deliberately set out to do in Manchester was to retain students. Manchester had always been a big university city, but people went away. They went to London and the Southeast once they graduated because the job opportunities were there. The objective of the city council was to keep them, give them a lively city to live in and a lively city that they could contribute to by bringing their brains into those new industries. So it can be done. The question now for today is whether it can be done for Bridgetown. We have three speakers who are going to address this question, and they're going to come at it from different angles. I've had a sneak preview of all the presentations, and I can tell you that I think you're going to be very stimulated by what they have to say. The first speaker today is Kelly Hunte. She is a senior housing planner in the Ministry of Housing, Lands and Maintenance. Her background is a B.Sc in Urban Environmental Studies, followed by an M.Sc in Urban and Development Planning, and postgraduate diploma in Public Sector Management. Kelly has worked on capital projects in the Urban Development Commission and in the Ministry, and played a lead role in many of the public sector housing projects in the island. She's also currently on the board of the UDC. Interesting aside is that there is absolutely no mention in her CV of doing development control or development management. So she's living proof that you can be a planner without doing development control. Kelly's going to talk about how the current housing situation came about in Bridgetown, the history of development, and the contribution that the public sector has made and can make. Our second speaker today is Hayden Hutton. He's the Chief Operating Officer of Terra Caribbean. I'm sure everybody knows of that organization. He's an RICS qualified surveyor and valuer, and he is essentially an expert on the economic and investment aspects of property development. This is underlined by one of his other qualifications. He has something called a CCIM. So he's a Certified Commercial Investment Member. And he's the only one in the island with that qualification, apparently. And I did a check that in the US, where the qualification originates, only 6% of the real estate professionals have got this qualification. So he's pretty unique. And he's an ideal person to be talking about the economic realities of the property market in Bridgetown and the appetite of investors to get involved. So Hayden will be talking about the barriers to making the city centre market work and how those barriers might be resolved. Our third speaker is Cherita O'dell, and she is another real estate broker, and she's behind the two brands $1 Million Homes and the Barbados Real Estate 246, which I think cater to different market segments. Cherita has a BA in Spanish and Managerial Studies and an MBA in Marketing and Human Resource Management. And she's got management experience in the hotel industry as well as her experience in real estate. Interestingly, she's also a former national long jump and triple jumper and an Olympian. And her activities extend to TV presenting and not surprisingly, on both property and sports shows. Cherita is going to tell us more about what might be possible in Bridgetown and what the future could look like. Before we move on to the speakers, there's just a little bit of housekeeping stuff I need to cover. You've all been sent copies of the webinar rules, which are basically about good manners and not causing offense to people. I don't think anybody can object to that. What we would like you to do is put your questions and comments into the chat box, and then Andy Gill, who is the Barbados Town Planning Society's Vice President, is going to field those questions, look at the ones which overlap, bring them together, and put them to the three speakers afterwards. So I would make one request, though, which is to please keep your comments and questions brief and concise, which will help Andy, and it will also mean that we can deal with more questions and more comments from a wider range of people and get a broad view of what people are thinking. So with no further ado, I'm going to move on to the first of our speakers, who is Kelly Hunte.
Before I start my presentation, I sincerely want to acknowledge the assistance that I got from one of my colleagues, Mrs. Cheyenne Smithen. And without her, this presentation would have looked very different. It would not be as vibrant as what you're going to see today. It would have been very basic black and white if it was just left up to me. So I just really want to say thanks and kudos to her for what you're about to see today. So my presentation is entitled Beyond the Bridge. And in preparation for this presentation, I actually took the time to go through Bridgetown again, look at it with fresh eyes, and ask myself, what am I actually seeing there? And the stark divide between what was happening on one side of the bridge and what was happening on the other side of the bridge, it was I couldn't ignore it. And around the bus stand, the Fairchild Street bus terminal, there's so much life, whether you're there during the day, whether you're there at night. There's life, there's movement. You can see the flow between the adjacent community and what is happening there. You come to the bridge, the Chamberlain Bridge, and you start to cross over. There was nothing. There was nothing. You drove through at night, there was literally nothing. I drove up Broad Street. there were 6 taxi drivers gathered at the Chafette at Lower Broad Street playing dominoes. To the top of Broad Street, the only people I encountered were cleaners on the street. And it made me ask myself, if I was a child growing up in Bridgetown, what lay beyond the bridge for me? What could I see? What could I aspire to? And that is the inspiration behind the presentation today, Beyond the Bridge. So I said I would take a historical perspective on what has happened in Bridgetown and then come to today. So the Bridgetown that we're talking about here is what we recognize today, pretty much the same parameters that define the city of Bridgetown, what we identify, or it's identified in the census as the city of Bridgetown. And at one point in time, so it peaked in 1871 at over 21,000 people. And at that point, Bridgetown, the city of Bridgetown, actually had more people living in it than the parish of St. Michael. So, and we know historically that was the peak of the sugar industry. There was slavery and all of the other things that came with that. But Bridgetown, we know, was hustling, bustling. The economy was booming. And clearly from this census data, Bridgetown was the place to be. By 1946, it had dropped to 13,000 people. And we all know of the infamous report of the Moyne Commission, the West Indian report, which described the housing conditions in Bridgetown as, in some instances, unfit for human habitation. Dangerous. You talked about cholera, disease spreading, unsanitary, dangerous. It was violent. And we know that we had the riots in 1937, where things reached a peak, where the conditions had become so intolerable to the persons that were living in Bridgetown. I was not able to pull any other data, any other census data that spoke to just the city of Bridgetown. In between these years, the most recent then is the 2000 census, and the population of Bridgetown had dropped to just about 6,000 people. And by 2010, we are under 5,000 people actually living in Bridgetown. And those are very, very significant numbers. Those the drop off cannot be ignored. So then we look at how has government intervened and how have these interventions coincided with the changes in the population, the residential population of Bridgetown. So with the riots being a pivot point in the life of Bridgetown, and around 1936, we have the creation of the St. Michael Vestry and the Bridgetown Housing Committee, which were addressing those same unsanitary, intolerable conditions that we were having in Bridgetown. The most visible results in terms of what they would have done remain at Bayville, and we know that there's quite an orderly, well-planned community at Bayville that we can still see today. The vestry and the housing committee then evolved into the housing board. We also had the establishment of the mortgage finance company, and later on in the mid-60s, we had the same housing board then becoming the National Housing Corporation. And again, these interventions now, we had the city still being very crowded, very congested, conditions still being quite unpleasant in the city. And we also had the Hurricane Janet in the 50s, which provided further impetus for expansion of housing outside of Bridgetown. So with the National Housing Corporation in the 60s, you saw deliberate efforts by the government to move people out of Bridgetown. And those things started with the creation of the housing estates at the Pine, the very large housing estates that are still there today. We have the Pine, and later on we had in Bridgetown, to help retain the population in Bridgetown, we had the creation of the Kensington Lodge estate. We have the blocks at Pondside. More recently, the London-born Towers, which are like a flagship within Bridgetown. We have the creation of the Country Park Towers, which are just on the outskirts. the Barbados Garden Project, which was created for the World Cup, and we moved persons from around the Pickwick Gap area. And the most recent thing, the TBC there needs to be constructed, and this is proposed new housing development at White Park Road. The Tenantries Freehold Purchase Act, and coming on behind that, the creation of the Urban Development Commission, also influenced what would have been happening in Bridgetown. So in Bridgetown, like in other areas of Barbados, the Tenantries Freehold Purchase Act gave persons the opportunity to own the freehold of the spots on which they were living. And that impacted Bridgetown in quite the same ways as it did the persons that were living on the plantation tenantries. And the facilitation of that for the persons in the urban areas came with the development of the Urban Development Commission, the creation of the Urban Development Commission. So it would have somewhat changed the dynamic of what was happening in town, where you would have had a lot of persons that were renters and a more transient community into persons now that have become freeholders, but very small plots of land in and around Bridgetown that persons now, so the communities are settled, and there's no reason for the persons that are living in these areas to be moving out of Bridgetown. But that creates a different dynamic now when we're looking at these settled residential areas with a view to redevelopment and revitalization. The other thing that would have impacted were additional relocation programs, and these would also serve to move persons out of Bridgetown, certainly very much within the central areas, move persons out of Bridgetown, further reducing the population. And we would have seen that with the creation of the sewage treatment plant, where we would have moved persons from around Emerton and Murphy's Pasture, and with the Church Village, persons that we would have relocated from Church Village, with the creation of the Central Bank, and more recently, the Church Village Greens. And I would have mentioned before the relocation from Kensington Oval for the World Cup. So that's the history. So where are we today? We have a Bridgetown that is in a state of transition. Let me put it that way. We can look around Bridgetown and we can see lots of opportunities. So what makes a city great? That was the question I asked, and I went to Google, because that's how we do science nowadays. I went to Google and I asked the question, what makes a city great? And this is one of the things that came back at me. Culture, buy-in, the outdoors, smart spending, connectedness, views, architecture. But I want you to pay particular attention to the point of buy-in and the point of smart spending. I think those are two very critical factors when we're considering the appeal of living in the city and how you get life back into the city and how you make the city desirable. So the other modern scientific approach I took was to use my WhatsApp chats and to ask a question. And I asked the question, would you live in Bridgetown? What would make you live in Bridgetown? How do you view Bridgetown? And these were some of the words that came back at me. Congested, vandalism, riotous living, the notion of debauchery is dirty, is smelly, the vagrance is unsafe, rodents. The impression that very average Bajans have is that Bridgetown is just not a place that they want to live. The other thing that came up very strongly was the notion of owning a piece of the rock. And also that persons that live in Bridgetown are viewed a little bit differently. So that's where we got the word trickster from. There's something other about persons that live in Bridgetown. There's a stigma that is associated with living in Bridgetown. Poor people live there, and it is not a place that persons aspire to be. So we're talking about perceptions of Bridgetown there. But what does Bridgetown actually offer? Bridgetown has loads of history, and this is also these comments are also coming from the same persons that would have identified the negatives about Bridgetown. They also talked about the history, that the history of Bridgetown was appealing, the monuments and, you know, the statues and stuff that are there, those things are appealing. They want to be associated with those things. The waterfront is very appealing. The fact that it's compact and walkable. They identify the green spaces, most notably the same Church Village Green. And what also stood out for me in the conversations was that Queen's Park was not seen as a desirable space, although persons kind of noted it was there, but they didn't see that as being connected to the city. And the fact that you had, it's a national transport hub. You could get in and out of Bridgetown at will. Quality of transportation is a whole different discussion, but we will accept the fact that it is a national transport hub. So this notion of how then do we translate into the same factors that persons that can identify the very negatives about Bridgetown can also identify the very positives of Bridgetown. How then do we transition to make it to something that they move past the negatives and want to live in Bridgetown? So the quotation here is just to highlight the point that making the city desirable, it has to be deliberate, it has to be well thought through, it has to be planned. It's not just going to happen. We have to want to make it happen. We have to determine to make it happen and put the process in place for that to happen. But Bridgetown has seen a series of revitalization efforts. These are few, we're all very familiar with them. And you know, we can identify them when we see them visually. You know, they're appealing. They're very, very appealing, and they stand out in the rest of Bridgetown. So that brought me to this point. In spite of all of these things, what is it that will move us to the point of having Bridgetown become that desirable place? And it struck me that culture will eat strategy for breakfast every time. We have been strategizing. There are numerous plans. Every physical development plan talks about the need to upgrade residential areas in Bridgetown. We have seen deliberate efforts to make the city more appealing, to drive investment, but yet we have a situation that the prime areas of Bridgetown are declining. The areas, there is life along Robert Street, and there's a residential population in and around Robert Street, and the economic activity that is coming back to Robert Street is reflective of things that people that live around there will need. So we're seeing restaurants, we're seeing fruit and vegetable shops, there's supermarkets, there's small recreational activities springing up. And this is even in the COVID time that we're seeing business developing along Robert Street, in as much as we are seeing the significant declines of businesses on Broad Street. As I mentioned earlier, there's lots of activity along the waterfront area with the bus terminal and the the Nelson Street, Pondside, London Moore Towers, residential areas that are just adjacent. And when you come through at night, you can see that dynamic between the areas playing out. So I drove down when I came into town on Sunday night, and you're seeing people relaxing along the kiosks in front of the bus terminal. If we were in Paris, we would say that the persons were socializing at sidewalk cafes and stuff. That's the way we would describe it. If we were seeing it in another city. And for me, it represented the sort of activity that we do want to see in Bridgetown. However, we come back to that question of buy-in and who is participating. The persons that the communities in and around Bridgetown are reflective of the social stratification that goes back to the 1800s. where that divide, so you're coming through all of the planning systems, all of the physical development plans, all of the upgrading plans that we've talked about, but we have not managed to dismantle the social stratification that has been historically associated with Bridgetown. And that is still playing out today in the way that persons view Bridgetown. What is happening in Bridgetown is very, very, you know, the legacy, the history, the impact of all of that is played out on the streets of Bridgetown, and we can't get away from that. And one of the things that we have done very, very successfully in Barbados is to sell persons on the notion of owning a piece of the rock. And that has underpinned the urban sprawl that we see across the country, and the move out from Bridgetown into the other parts of Barbados. So we're at a stage now where if we want to bring life back into Barbados, into Bridgetown, then we certainly would need to create a situation where Bridgetown becomes as desirable as any other part of Barbados. So can housing help revitalize Bridgetown? This was the key question that we were asked to address. And my answer to that is a resounding yes. And I think that the projects that the government has done, the London-born Towers, the Pondside, the same Kensington Lodge, we can see that, for me, those are quite successful efforts, examples that show that housing can help revitalize Bridgetown. Those areas, the housing in those areas has changed how people view those areas. So we don't hear the negativity associated with London-born Towers and Kensington Lodge as we hear with the other areas. So like the New Orleans, the Cat's Castle, the Green Fields, the other areas that we do not need to be upgraded. But the housing that has the new style of housing, or the more modern style, the higher density style of housing that has been built at those locations has changed the perception of how people see those areas. And these housing projects still are alongside some of the same areas that still require upgrading, but persons just don't view them in the same way. And London-born Towers is the example that people always refer to. If I could live in Bridgetown, I would want to live at London-born Towers. It's got the waterfront, they like the layout, they like how it's appealing, the location is appealing. And just across the bridge, this is literally across the bridge again, I just couldn't get away from the notion of the bridge. We've got Sunjet House. Again, that used to be an iconic building in Bridgetown. It is dilapidated. The windows at the street level are broken out. It is just a horrific sight. You don't want to be there. And again, the two bottom photos to give the example of the contrast of life on one side of the bridge versus the other side. So we've got persons relaxing, enjoying what the bars have to offer, versus the silence. The lady was standing there and she just looked so lonely, and every other door in that building was closed. That's on our waterfront. The boats are there, the perfect spot for relaxation. And the persons on the other side, they're relaxing at these bars and there are buses passing by them, but it is busy, there's life going on, versus the juxtaposition with Brigade House, where we should have persons, Bridge House, sorry, where we should have persons relaxing along that waterfront and enjoying everything that the city has to offer. So my point with that is we need to create a culture in the same way that we have successfully created that culture of owning a piece of the rock. We need to have a definite culture change that causes Barbadians to view Bridgetown as desirable, as wanting to live there, not just to want a piece of the rock now, but to want in on Bridgetown. And everybody must be able to think that there is something there for them. We've got persons of lower income who are keeping the city alive at night, or at least portions of the city alive at night. We need to be able to replicate that across, create middle areas, create high-end areas, and make the city something that every Barbadian thinks, I am part of this, I want a part of this. The last photo here, for me, represents the hope. This is the site at White Park Road where the National Housing Corporation will be doing its next residential development in Bridgetown. It is not associated with any particular project. So this provides the opportunity to bring new residents into Bridgetown. So, it's a little, not the most appealing photo, but for me, it represents the hope that, housing can come back into Bridgetown and will help with the revitalization of Bridgetown. I thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. That was, as I said, I expected all the presentation. That was very stimulating. You've outlined a lot of the problems, but you've also been positive, and you've actually left a challenge, which the following two speakers, I hope, can take up, because there's only so much that the public sector can do. And I think that's the case anywhere, particularly in cash-strapped times like these. But I'd like to hear what the situation looks like to the private sector and what the private sector thinks the barriers are and how those barriers can be dealt with. And I think that lets us move smoothly across to Hayden's presentation. I think he should be ready now.
Good afternoon. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I wish I went before Kelly and not after. Kelly, that was a brilliant presentation. I've got lots to learn. I'm going to just share my screen. Everybody see my screen? Thumbs up? Anybody?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good.
Thumbs up. Right. So thanks for having me again, guys. Appreciate being here. I don't think I was the first person you asked. I think you asked somebody else. They were busy and a couple others. So I was about number 4, but doesn't matter. Here we are. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to share 4 things with you. 2 insights, an idea, and a request. 2 insights, an idea, and a request. The first thing was I had to get educated on where Bridgetown was because I didn't know. So after speaking to Kim and Sandy, I had to go and dig out the PDP, and realizing that I spent a lot more time in Bridgetown than I knew. So that was where I started. But then in trying to answer the question, Kim, that you asked, we thought that we would focus specifically on the city center, just to try and have a much more sort of focused and sharp discussion around what was happening in the city center. So I'm going to offer an insight just on what's happening, maybe through the lens of the market, through a real estate agent's lens. So what's happening in the city center today? So like Kelly, the first thing I did is I went and took a drive around the city center just to see what I could see. And that's what I saw. That's what I saw. I saw a lot of signs for rent, for sale. And typically in a market, there are 2 things you look for in a market: cranes and signs. And when you see cranes and signs, usually you want to have some pause. So that then led me to think about, well, let me just get a random set of 6 landmark buildings. I'm calling them landmark just because that's what I'm calling them. They were random buildings that I picked in the city center, genuinely randomly. So these buildings were about 200,000 square feet of leasable area within that city center area, which again is Wharf Road, Hink Street, Jubilee Gardens, up behind the city center parking lot, down Swan Street, and back to the bridge. So about 200,000 square feet, 6 buildings. And I was wondering to myself, what does the occupancy look like? How much of that red bar, if that red bar is the leasable space, how much of it is actually occupied? So the short answer was not a lot. Red would reflect occupied there, and the gray reflects vacant. So building 2 obviously has a bit of a problem. Building 6 has an even bigger problem. And a number of things to think about when you see this level of vacancy. Maybe the first thing is just quickly, what does the actual vacancy mean commercially for the building owner? So just try to follow me here, and I'm going to, math is not my strong point, but I'm going to try to just give you a very, very simple example of Kim decides to purchase a building in Bridgetown, $1 million. It has $100,000 in net operating income. So effectively, his going in cap is 10%. What he's probably going to do, because he's a clever guy, is he's going to go to the bank, he's going to borrow $500,000. So he'll get a typical commercial term, 6%, 15-year term. So effectively what he's doing is he's leveraging up, and he's got positive leverage because his going in cap is higher than his cost of funds. His overall cost of funds is about 3%. So he's leveraging up, everything looks good. Absolutely brilliant, off he goes. Problem is vacancy then starts to climb in the building. When that vacancy gets to 50%, in my very simple example, that's actually the break even on the cash flow. Because for you to service that annually, that's the break even on the cash flow. So Kim is starting to sweat now. The other part of it is we need to remember that when we have vacancy, but it's not just a rent vacancy, it's that Kim now as landlord has to pick up the vacant share of the service charge. So typically he would apportion in his lease some to base rent, some to service charge. When he's vacant, he's effectively then picking back up the operating expenses. So further erosion. Landlord might also have some other expenses that are not covered in the service charge, more erosion again. So what happens at 50% in this very simple example is cash flow now negative, debt service is a problem. So then the question is here, well, how are you going to keep the building looking good? How are you going to maintain it, sinking fund to improve it, maybe install some green components and all those fancy things? Well, I don't know. The cycle repeats and then the buildings decline over time. So then values decline. So at that level of vacancy, any landlord is going to really be sort of sitting in their seat and sweating, saying, look, this is just not tenable. That vacancy is actually 70%. So we find 6 buildings in the city center, 70% vacant. So few things to think about. You drive by one of the buildings and you see some tenants and you think, oh, well, it's, you know, they're tenants in. But you have space vacancy and you have revenue vacancy. And what has been happening in Bridgetown over the last many years, I suppose, is that you have revenue vacancy in the form of discounts. So you have tenants in spaces who previously might have been paying $100 per square foot per annum, say on the ground floor fronting Broad Street. Now they're paying a different rent because the landlord has had to discount that rent. And of course, there are a couple of other factors here. There's the pandemic impact, of course, which has obviously had a notable impact, not just in Bridgetown, but everywhere else. So the first insight, again, 2 insights, an idea and a request, is that on this trajectory, an investment in a building in the city center is just no longer an attractive proposition. It just isn't. However, maybe there is another use case. Building on the left, that's a 4-story building. That was my best graphic effort at a 4-story building. It's a Bridgetown building. Building on the right is an office building in Warrens. What tends to happen in Bridgetown, and again, there are many examples of this, and it depends on the type of building, whether it's residential, pardon me, whether it's retail only, whether it's a mall, whether it's an office building, but by and large, there's a disproportionate distribution of value and rent in the building. So from a practical point of view, ground floor of the Bridgetown building, about 55% of the total rent typically is taken in on the ground floor. And it gets less and less and less as you go up. And again, you could pick different buildings and have different examples, but this is just a general picture, and I think it's a fair one. However, if you take a building in Warrens, there's a much more equitable distribution of the rent in the building. by and large, you're not going to charge more for your accounting service if you're on the second floor than if you're on the first floor. So all things equal, you're willing to pay the same rent. You might have a retail bank on the ground floor, they're building in Warrants, and they'll pay a couple of dollars more. Top floor, maybe somebody's got a big ego and they'll pay $2 more to be on the top floor. But by and large, the distribution is a lot more balanced. Whereas in Bridgetown, it's very bottom heavy. And the reason it's bottom heavy, we all know. So many of those buildings in Bridgetown, on the top floor, you'll find either vacant or it's being used as storage and it's being rented very cheaply. Having said that, we then thought about the Bridgetown building and that distribution of value. And then we thought about residential. And if you think about it, residential actually works the opposite. We don't put penthouses on the ground floor in residential. We put the penthouses on the top. So we then thought, well, why not overlay the two philosophies of how Bridgetown operates today and how residential operates? And actually, maybe it's a good fit because the 10% gets much bigger. So then what about residential? Maybe it's a timely thought. And as a quick aside, as many of you may be aware, the Bridgetown's longest standing resident recently vacated. So perhaps that's an opportune time to have this conversation about new residents. I see one person smiling, he got it. Thanks, Peter. So what we thought we would do is we would have a survey. Sorry, I'm just going to go back and talk you through this survey. We thought, like you, Kelly, we would have a survey just to really see how people feel about residential in the city. We didn't want to assume. So only 10 questions, and there's a lot of talk about whether you should have 50 questions and the level of detail that you should have. But our experience has been that people simply don't respond to those long surveys. So there were 300 respondents and a very, very broad demographic. So I'm just going to run through quickly here and give you the results of that survey. First question was, how often do you visit the city center? So Kelly, this is a little bit like yours, but just a smidge, maybe more formal perhaps. And it was stunning just how infrequently the respondents visited the city center. Only 4% visit very frequently. The second question was, well, sort of, why do you go? Are you going for shopping, business, banking, what have you? And obviously you can see a substantial share on shopping and business. Banking, I'm not sure who's going for the nightlife. That was one person. What are your views on the city center as a destination to shop and do business? How do you generally feel? Only 20% positive, twice the amount negative. So again, I think this gets back to what Kelly was saying, the sort of attitudes generally in Bridgetown, and the brand is perhaps not where it needs to be. How does the city center compare to other CBDs, to other central business districts? Again, just our informal way of asking, you know, if you said, how does it compare? I think we said to Six Roads, Warren, Spicetown, etc. How does it compare? And again, here's where the language began to get a bit stronger. 62% said worse, only 13% better. But then we had a pivot in the survey and started asking the question that we wanted to ask is, do you actually think, and again, this is restricted to the city center, do you actually think that the city center is ready for residential today? And quite a strong response, we thought. 50% of respondents saying yes. But then we went on to ask, well, would you actually live in a high-rise in the city center? So the graphic on top is the answer to that, and I've just inlaid below the original answer. But at least a third still said they would live in a city center in the high-rise. Pardon me, in a high-rise in the city center. And again, you have to control for that, because the reality is we are asking people who would live in a high-rise anywhere because they want to live in a house with a garden and a white picket fence out in the country. So you do have to control for that. But then we asked, who is best suited to live in that type of a building? Young professionals, no surprise. Students, welcome stampers. Expats. not a lot of families. And I think that's probably what was in play in the previous question. Is that if you have a lot of families responding, well, they're not going to pick up to go and live in a high rise anywhere. And then in this question, we actually restricted the respondents to only 2. You could only pick 2 on this one. You can see crime, cleanliness, parking, congestion, almost all exactly the same. So what that actually means is that a lot of respondents came up with those top 4 themselves, regardless of which was their top 2. And again, there really is no surprise to any of those. Just really quantifies the level of emphasis on them, perhaps. But then when we ask, how likely do you think we actually will see any significant resi development within 5 years? The number drops. So 50% say, yeah, let's do it. But only 14% say we're likely to do it. Why is that? Maybe because there's a lot of talk about it. Maybe because they think it's a chicken and an egg. Who knows? The last question was a write-in question. And normally when we have these write-in questions, people don't respond. You kind of eject at that point in the survey and you say, well, thanks, I gave you my answers, I'll just move on. But boy, the responses to this were stunning. So this is just a bunch of screenshots from some of the responses here. And if you look in the bottom right over that fantastic logo in the bottom right of the screen, you can see one of those really long answers. I mean, people really engaged. The passion was just sort of palpable. And when you read all the responses, they were absolutely fantastic. I mean, we were really, really quite grateful for all the responses that we got. So just some key themes on the responses. Infrastructure, refurbish and reuse, what I think the PDP refers to as adaptive reuse, crime and security, traffic again. No surprise, you know, the discussion around making Bridgetown a, Broad Street pedestrian only. I think that's what's being referred to. Improved amenities and attractions. And again, all the comments were very, very, very positive. I must say the passion coming through in the comments was really quite something. There was one exception, however, where somebody said, and I believe this is perhaps a technical planning term, maybe, Kim, you would have to tell me. Somebody said that Bridgetown was popped down. So I have a feeling that perhaps it's the previous resident who was asked to vacate. Perhaps he was the one that made the comment. So my insight for you, number 2, second insight, it's time for another use case in the city center. It's time for another use case in the city center. There's just huge passion for the city center, and we think for residential. So why are we still here today? Again, I had to go and educate myself because, you know, talking to a few of my colleagues in the office who were equally as passionate, the thing that occurred to me was, from a policy point of view, the Bridgetown Community Development Plan that I think all the far more educated planners on this call that I am know the details of, is very, very detailed, absolutely brilliant. The Carlisle Bay redevelopment plan. I mean, you have so many plans from a policy perspective. We're not short on good ideas. We have ideas everywhere. The private sector, through the chamber, has had a number of absolutely fantastic initiatives and schemes in concert with the IDB and just done all these brilliant things and gone so far. From a concessionary perspective, we have SDA in Bridgetown, we have TDA, we have CAP 67B. So from a policy framework for concessions, it's all there. It's all there. But for some reason, here we are today, again, in the city center. Why is that? Well, maybe it is that the cows have finally, Peter, you with me? So here's a quick idea that I'm going to run through. I'm just watching my time and I want to respect everybody's time on the call. Back to the same philosophy, building on the building on the left and inverting the concept of how the Bridgetown buildings are working today. What if Now, my location here for this 10-story building is somewhere out, and I think it's actually what's defined in the Carlisle Bay redevelopment plan as Strategic Reinvestment Area D, which is by Hink Street, by Carlisle House, and out by Marshall Hall. Is to have a site that's somewhere on the perimeter in the city center. We're going to build an eco-modern building, sustainable, PV, maybe even off-grid. Security, smartphone access, smart parking, etc., etc. Ground floor of this building could be coffee shop, iMart, restaurant, other retail and convenience retail. First floor in this building could be a gym, daycare, co-working space, gym, daycare, co-working space, all open to the public. Anybody who's in Bridgetown coming through, people working in Bridgetown could have their kids in daycare, use the gym in the afternoon, go and plug into the co-working space in the afternoon. Could have educational events for Bridgetown use in the evening. Upstairs, 8 floors of residential, but the key here is that it's long-term rental. I'm not asking you to commit permanently to the city center yet. I'm starting with rental. And that's a bit of a change in paradigm because as a market, we don't have rental buildings. Everywhere else in the world you go, the planners on the call know. There's rental buildings at scale. There are rental buildings that are designed and developed purely for medium and long-term rentals. In Barbados, what tends to happen is we have developers who unwittingly become landlords because perhaps we build too many condos, can't get them sold, so they end up being put for rent in long-term. But the key here is there's a long-term rental building, simple, clean, modern units that rent for a reasonable rent. But perhaps you need to relook the concessions and ensure they're disruptive enough to actually make it happen. What tends to happen sometimes on the concessions, my observation, certainly not an expert on them, is they tend all to be on the supply side. What is the developer, the funder, and all the team doing the development need? And we don't focus on the demand side. The demand side is actually the most important. If I told Kim that he could rent a unit in this building and he would get a full tax credit for the rent he paid, he'd be tripping over himself to get into this building. The key is it would have to be targeted at the right audience. And I've been doing a little bit of informal surveying within the office. And no surprise, all of the millennials, younger people who might buy into that sort of concept say, absolutely brilliant. I absolutely would live there. Easy access to the South Coast, easy access to the West Coast, as long as you address some of the issues that have been raised in the survey. So we all know that there are other projects planned for the area as well. And of course, all the projects across the way, including what's going to happen with the Hyatt and the Careenage, will catalyze. BTI is doing their bit. The Constitution River Phase 3 is on its way. Freedom Park is on its way. And I'm sure that most of the planners on the call are probably very well aware of the proposal for an RFP for the Treasury building to convert that to residential, which is upcoming. So it could well be that momentum could be building and that perhaps the passion for Bridgetown will fuel that development. I think for the city center, though, we just need to lay the first brick. So we've had 2 insights, an idea, and a request. So this is my request. When I was talking to a few of my colleagues in the office in the last sort of couple of days, fumbling around trying to get ready for this presentation, I asked them, when last did you go to Bridgetown to shop, get something? A lot of people couldn't even remember when last they went into Bridgetown specifically. Well, I think maybe 2 years ago for Christmas, couldn't remember. So my ask is, for everybody on the call, within the next 30 days, let's go and show Bridgetown some love. Let's all commit to going to Bridgetown, into the city center and park, get out your car, go and have a walk past the synagogue, down Swan Street, go and buy something for your husband, your wife, your partner, your whoever else, your kids. Or within the next 30 days, that everybody on the call would commit to doing that now, rather than we keep talking, waiting for the things to happen in the future. And you know that I'm not going to ask you to do that if I did it myself. So yesterday, I went in my car, I drove down to Bridgetown, I parked, and the entire outfit that I'm wearing today, I bought in Bridgetown yesterday. So I got my pants from Broad Street, I got the shirt from a lovely store in Swan Street and had a great chat, and it was an absolutely fantastic experience. Until I got dressed this morning to come to the office to get ready for this presentation, and my wife said to me, she said, those pants are too tight, you can't leave the house. She said, your pants are too tight and you shouldn't be wearing skinny jeans. Well, suffice to say, I was reliably informed by the salesperson yesterday they look great, so I'm not having it. So just a quick summary, folks, because my time is about up. On the present trajectory we're on, an investment in a building in the city is just no longer an attractive proposition. Number two, it's time for another use case in the city center. And I think we're ready for residential. There's no question about it. Perhaps a mixed-use rental building, targeting and incentivizing specific residents and occupants, but importantly, embracing the city, embracing everybody in the city. And my request, let's show Bridgetown some love. And with that, I will thank you all very much indeed. It's my privilege to have your time. I'll stop my share and I will turn off my camera and back over to you, Kim.
Thank you, Hayden. That was, again, very, very stimulating. I'm happy to say I never invested in that big old building in Bridgetown, although I might be tempted to invest in something in the future. That was great. You've given us some realities, and you've given us some detail of the issues that need to be addressed. It's actually making me think about what our next session in this series might be, which is about, could well be about making Bridgetown more livable by addressing issues like the crime and the traffic, etc., and the cleanliness. So that was very helpful. What I want to do now is go straight on to Cherita. I hope she's got her presentation ready, and then we can move forward. She's just coming up now with the screen sharing. We're away. Thank you.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I have certainly enjoyed what I heard so far, and it definitely gives us food for thought. I'm going to come from the perspective of, well, what can we really expect out of Bridgetown when it comes to housing? And I'm going to put some things to you and allow you to have a think. Now, the reality is this: people gravitate to cities which are attractive in nature, not just from a physical perspective in terms of its infrastructure, but by the very nature of its personality, its vibe. A city has a life of its own. So in my opinion, before we can even talk about residential living in our city center, we have to create a vibrant downtown strategy, all right? So let's start by agreeing that we have a sexy city center. Look at it. Listen, I have been to some Caribbean countries and we have a harmonious fusion of the colonial style of architecture, in some instances, some nice modern interiors. So we cannot say Bridgetown isn't physically attractive. Block out the derelict buildings, you know, but overall, it is attractive. It lights up beautifully at night, and during the day, it has a buzz which is undeniable. And so it checks the comes to physicality. Now, it is customary that a city center is the commercial heartbeat of a country that pumps the blood into other vital organs of the body, the social activity, the economic activity, the political creativity and policy and so forth, and around and around and around it goes circuitously. And that in turn influences the influx of the people. So we therefore cannot talk about residency in the absence of these organs firing first and on full throttle. So what I'm going to do is just give you a quick idea as to, hang on, here we go. Give you a quick idea as to what I'm going to touch on today. And we've just had a mention of what attracts people to a city center. If we want to talk about residential development, it must be in conjunction with a vibrant downtown first and foremost. And in my opinion, This is the chicken which will indeed lay the golden egg. We're then going to look at some strategies to create a foundation for residential living. And I'm going to do some comparison and contrasting with some models that have been pretty successful. And we're going to wrap up with, is residential transformation in Bridgetown realistic? And thank you for the other two speakers for setting the tone. And what I like about what they've done, they've given us hope. They've given us hope. All is not lost. So in terms of what is possible? Well, everything in life is possible with a plan, of course, and without a plan, the people perish. So let's get underway. Let's look at our strategies. First off, as I mentioned before, we have to bring the cultural life back to the city. Kelly, great presentation. It hurt my heart when you showed this waterfront with the lone lady standing there, because this is what it used to be. You know, this is when I visited Curacao, this was the hustle and bustle in the Carinage area. It was lively. And the reality is that if we want residential money to flow into the city center, above and beyond government housing, affordable housing, what do you have to do? What do you have to do? You have to stage a diversity of high quality events, high quality activities. And note that I didn't say high price events, but high quality. Because once you do that, you'll then attract a certain aspect of the demographic. I think we can all agree that the models of housing so far have been to the benefit of the lower classes, the lower middle class, the middle class. We are missing an entire demographic when it comes to Bridgetown. And without going hardcore into gentrification, because, well, there's much there to shove out of the way anyhow, we need to bring in some people with money. Money follows money, and money then gets injected into the commerce and the heart of the city center. So here's some proposals I have. Every 3 weeks, you know, there should be some initiative that touches on premium gallery art, customized jewelry, cuisine, and music, either blended or individually. But note that I didn't just say art and craft and food. Been there, done that. We're known for that. Change the caliber of the offering. And repeating, so doing, you will then elevate the level of diversity. Another example, every last Saturday of the month, perhaps, let's stage a nighttime market similar to Oystons in the heart of the city. But you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna block off certain strategic areas, whether it is the boardwalk, Broad Street, this Saturday, Church Village, so it doesn't become stale and repetitive. And then we're gonna put on activities and events like jazz, speakeasy, literary whatevers. And you rent out the booths at some nominal figure, whether it's $75 to set up, whatever it is you're gonna set up. But the key is to mix vendors and locations up so that you're offering something. What makes Barbados attractive to tourists all over the world? The offerings. Is promoted as a destination. We need to take Bridgetown now and promote it also as a destination, a microcosm within the bigger picture. Now, similar to how Nicholas Branker did a little event on Easter as a gift for the people, that's the caliber of entertainment I'm talking about staging on a continuous basis, not on a one-off concert here and there. And obviously we would partner with the National Cultural Foundation. I'm sure there's some old grants there that we can tap into so we can pay our musicians and so forth, but that's how you get life back into the city. Another quick example, currently there's a group of 4 young men that on their own stage a monthly art event, which involves food and beverage, a demographic of 20 to 30-year-olds, young professionals. And they don their best apparel, they come out everybody looking cute, and they're all into the art. And let's not reinvent the wheel, drafting those kind of, you know, private initiatives into perhaps coming out every quarter and adding something additional of value to the city center. That's what city centers should be about, life, variety, and so forth. And last example on this topic, rather than worrying about a place, let's take the Empire. Now, forever we've been hearing what to do with the empire, what to do with this building. You know what? Leave it. Yes, I said that. Leave it open to the elements. You know, by the time you dress that up with sexy lighting and put some seating in there, transform it, but keep it just as is, a part of history, modernized. You know, when I visited Caesarea in Israel and the Colosseum in Rome, what were they doing? They took stadia that were hundreds of years old and made them serve as the backdrops for concerts and dramatic presentations and so forth. Let's do that rather than spending years deciding what to do with the building. Leave it, use it, let's move on. So coming out of that, you then have the concept of branded districts. And branded districts, just like we brand a destination, we brand something that you want people to buy. A branded district lures people to visit it. Let's take a look at some transformation in a couple cities so you get a sense as, you know, to what I'm talking about, and then we could kind of see how we can do that here in Bridgetown. Now, Brixton, and this is an interesting model. Some would say successful, some would say it was troubling in the fact of gentrification issues, pushing out people that were there for years, etc. But bear with me, bear with me. Now, Brixton is in South London, and in 2001, the borough of Lambeth had 64,000 registered voters. 2001, just 20 years ago. In 2013, this figure has risen to 284,000. Are you listening to me? Almost the population of Barbados. I mean, that in itself speaks volumes. Now Brixton was known as the gritty city. Anything that you could think of that was wrong and a vice and criminal, Brixton had it up front and center, right? Prostitution, drugs, name it, they had it. But now there's a definite ambience of and soul that surrounds the entire area and making it increasingly sought after. So Banksy, artist, he deemed it worthy enough of an artwork back in 2003, and more recently there've been photographic exhibitions and other cultural displays. The area has become so desirable that residential property prices have increased by 25% in 2013 alone. So remember, Kelly was taking us into the fact that, and Kelly, those descriptions made me smile because I felt a little guilty. You know, when we thought of poverty and smelliness and vagrancy and this and the other, Brixton had it, poster child. But they went from what? 64,000 people, registered voters, to 284,000. The artistic pull of the area is still incredibly strong, so much so that Brixton see it as the like foodie hotspot and with a range of. But what exactly happened? Brixton became a destination. You hear what I'm telling you? Going back to that point again, I was a hotelier in my past life, so I know about marketing stuff. Destination. Brixton became a destination, and 5,000 square feet of commercial space, which once fetched between 5,000 to 7,000 pounds, rent can now pull in 20,000 pounds. You got it? So what started happening is that this development caught the interest of developers who didn't just build residential developments, and I think Hayden made mention of this type of build, but mixed-use spaces. So they had the residences above, the galleries and restaurants and so forth below. Okay, now granted, all isn't perfect in Brixton. As I said, as you see at the bottom there, gentrification issues hover, but you get the idea of what is possible. Now let's take a peek at this one, the distillery district. And this is just stimulating ideas for us folks. We got the rum, we got the culture, what we can do with it, huh? So this is Toronto. After deindustrialization and with winding down a distillery operation in this particular district, the area became increasingly derelict and dead quiet. Remember, Kelly was mentioning across the bridge, totally different setting. So let's keep this in mind. The prize, however, is that the 13-acre district contained the largest and best preserved collection of Victorian-era industrial architecture in North America. It was designated as a National Heritage Site. Sounding familiar? In the process of awaiting redevelopment and reinvestment, a developer took a chance. That's what we need. Well, we as realtors, Hayden, we need to encourage the developers to take a chance. And 2 condominium projects were erected on the periphery of the site in the 1990s. Watch the domino effect now. The area then started to serve as the backdrop for numerous film shoots. And since 1990, it has served as a location for hundreds of film and TV productions. In 2001, the site was purchased by Cityscape Holdings, and which transformed the district into a pedestrian-oriented area. You get a sense there in that middle photo. Work was completed and the district reopened to the public by 2003. The new owners refused to lease any of the retail and restaurant space to chains or franchises. And accordingly, the majority of the buildings are occupied with boutiques, art galleries, restaurants, jewelry stores, cafes and coffee houses, including a well-known microbrewery. Having seen that, the other developers now came running and they started more buildings on the outskirts. What's interesting to note is that the Pan American Games Athletics Village was built there in 2015, and the Athletes Village was then converted into, get this, townhouses, condos, affordable housing, and retail space. Got it? Good. So I am seeing endless possibilities already. Next thing I want us to do, let's make underutilized public property available for private sector development. Now, let's be honest, we know that government owns real estate that sometimes is either vacant, abandoned, obsolete, call the words. But rather than hanging on to these properties until Jesus turns wine back into water, we know that refurbishment can be an expensive undertaking. So why not make these structures prime candidates for redevelopment by the private sector, you know, who can access multiple sources of funds, perhaps a bit more easy than having to go through all the red tape that we know is there. Take the money and inject it into some programs that will have a higher return on value for the community, and let the private sector transform the cityscape. We can't put the burden all the time on poor government. You know, we have to look outside them. Take a look at this. And this, listen, if you can take a power plant, for goodness sakes, a power plant, Seahome Power Plant in Austin, Texas, and transform this bad boy into something beautiful. I mean, come on. We could take any piece of infrastructure that we have and bring it to life. So thanks to a unique partnership with the city of Austin, Seahome Power Plant, they actually combine cultural and community needs in an exceptional setting for residents and visitors to enjoy for generations to come. And this redevelopment includes, look at this, folks, look at this, 143,000 square feet of office space. Well, with all the people working from home right now, we don't need any more office space. 280 high-rise condos, 48,000 square feet of retail shops and restaurants and meeting space, all surrounded by this dramatic and accessible plaza. And this is all emerging out of a power plant that was around from back in the 1980s. It sat on 5 acres, and the transformation created more than 200 jobs and was expected to produce $2 million a year in tax revenue. Derelict power plant. You hear what I'm telling you? Derelict. Let's look at this. Let's reactivate underutilized public property. Now, as we've discussed, and you can hear the common thread all the time, mass exodus of businesses from Bridgetown. And sadly, inclusive in this relocation are many government offices. Now, contentious, but I can say it. I believe that there is a strong message sent to the outside world when a country's government and community offices are located in a single location. I'm just saying. When we take a look at the Washington Mall in the US, that serves as a united front. Government agencies and organizations in one geographic zone. It sends a message. There's something powerful about a country when there appears to be a synergy among its government organizations. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not negating the use of satellite offices outside the city center. We know they've gone to Warren, South Coast, this and the other. I'm not negating that. But what I'm saying is that, you know, our government's core being in the city center, what does it do? It attracts increased employees. It increases the demand for more restaurants and services. And folks, it just looks plain old busy. It looks busy. It keeps the city center buzzing and the focal point in our country's business activities. Imagine the added value of even a small convention center in the heart of Bridgetown. Guess what? Somebody might be now able to take one of the buildings that's sitting there and transform it into a boutique corporate hotel. So imagine in the heart of the city, you now have the corporate visitor. And they're gonna love it because it's conveniently located to a variety of amenities, they get to their meetings and so forth. So we may not be able to keep the rest of corporate Barbados in Bridgetown, but if there is one entity that can dictate favorable rents and concessions for their own, it is the government. All right, and we're winding down. You see it there. The mistake we make is that when we think of revitalizing a city's residential activity, we often think just in terms of condos, affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We often don't think of the value of dorms or student housing because of their perceived lower yield. Okay, I get it. But ask those who live in the areas surrounding UE if they are stressed about pulling in as much rent as other owners in the south and west coast of the island. You think they would beg to differ. Their rent is consistent every year, and in the instances of those who rent out by the room, they're actually pulling in a higher yield than if they were renting a full apartment, all right? So pay attention to university housing and the benefits it brings. You know, let's keep our eyes on that treasury building there. Let's keep our eyes on it, make it straightforward. Who here has traveled to university towns? Let me tell you something. Case in point would be the University of Texas, San Antonio. They have everything you could need. You have the university, yes, but the surroundings are rife with life because of what the university offers. A little taste of an example here. Let's look at the villages at Coverley and Ross University. The supermarket in their benefits. The gym benefits, the little restaurants benefits, the social areas and all that stuff are bustling, and the developer certainly benefits. And don't be fooled, university students are not all young and giddy-headed. As in the case of many medical universities, for example, if you want to be a bit more touchless and pick something of a higher status, medical universities, the demographic is often a sophisticated student in their late 20s or 30s, often well-financed, if they're coming out of the US or Canada. Place the coffee shops, they'll enjoy it. Place the entertainment centers, that's how you get entertainment of a higher level in town. You got the transportation already, the store owners benefit, and anyone with a credit card machine will certainly smile all the way to the bank. Students are often what? Asset poor, sorry, but debt rich. So how do we attract these developers? This is the bait. This is what developers look for. They look for growing economy with the opportunity to generate a return. They want to make sure their money grows. They look for excellent international links and effective supply chains. Do they have a hassle trying to get in things? Do they have a hassle, you know, if they're building holiday rental accommodation, can people get here easily? If you need materials delivered, you know, political and executive leadership which prioritizes investment. Luckily, I am grateful for the leadership that we have right now. You could see is embraced, you know, so that's a good thing. and a focus on delivery, smooth and easy processes. Developers, yes, we have local developers, but the reality is sometimes those come in with the money that can transform acreage and blocks and so forth are coming from outside, let's be honest. And they want to know that when they come in and they're trying to get things done, they are not seen as the enemy, folks. They want to be embraced as customers, you know, that is how they want to be seen. So here's the deal, in closing. By creating the activities and events, you can expose a wider portion of your community to the unique assets located in your urban core. If Bajans see Bridgetown as a place to go for activities besides just getting school socks and reactivating their credit card, they will come. The place will look busy, and busyness attracts. An added benefit of these events I mentioned before too, they engage local merchants, artists, entrepreneurs, and you help make these business people champions for downtown revitalization. We're making a good effort in adding green spaces. Okay, I'll give Jack his jacket. And they're inviting for recreation and invaluable for families and so forth. We've made good strides in our parking centers to accommodate greater volumes of people, great. And our transportation outlets, you know, flank the strategic points of the city center. Now, the Hyatt might be a little bit of a point of contention, but I'm an optimist. And I honestly believe that the construction of the Hyatt is going to serve as a catalyst for other hotels and other developer IEs to follow. That's what they look at. Oh, the Hyatt going there? Well, let me see what happens. Let's take a chance. And I honestly believe that we are on the cusp of creating the ultimate canvas for a ballsy developer or developers to step up and say, now is the time. Sometimes the best time to start businesses, start new opportunities and so forth is such a time as this. Pandemic, volcano, everything going to hell in a handbasket, perfect. The likelihood of success is so much higher. I envision, and this is I envision Bay Street, the end of Bay Street there, Harbor Road, and the buildings of the waterfront. I envision those buildings as oceanfront condos. People will pay a premium, and guess what? They're not, in so doing, pushing out the existing residents of Bridgetown, but they're adding another dimension of the demographic that we currently have. I'm going to be a little bit naughty and say, look, if Rachel Pilgrim, if you know your history, you know that she ran the Royal Navy Hotel and a brothel. But if she could set up the Royal Navy Hotel, albeit with her sketchy immoral behavior in the heart of Bridgetown, and become a millionaire out of it, affluence galore, how much more can we entice legitimate developers to transform existing spaces to the benefit of our society's fabric? So in closing, I will leave you with this. Stagnating cities have declining downtowns. Vibrant cities have growing downtowns. So we know what we need to do, right? We are not dead yet. And as I said, now is the perfect time to pivot. And I truly believe that Bridgetown can come back to life. Jumping on to what Hayden said, we got to stop talking and just start doing. So it's up to the realtors to start showing Bridgetown in a different light. You know, maybe we could be one of the people to say, I brought in the first, condo development there into the waterfront. Yeah, I sold them on it, they got it. I know that decision helped add a new dimension to the city center. So the onus has to be on us. We can't put everything on the government. We have to do our share too. And I think once we, put in the effort, try the initiatives, Bridgetown can certainly bounce back. We are not dead yet, folks. I thank you.
Thank you, Cherita. That was brilliant. and all the presentations have been brilliant. If I go back to my Manchester experience, I said it was policy driven. Well, yes, you need the policy, you need the drive, and you've actually shown us that you need the imagination as well. So thank you very much. And with that, I think we need to rapidly go on to the questions, because I know things have been coming in and I've seen compliments as well as questions. So if Andy is there, perhaps he can come on with some of the questions from the chat.
Hey, thanks, Kim. Congrats to all the presenters. That was really very inspiring and excellent presentation by everyone. Kelly, Hayden, and Cherita, well done. Great job. So we have in the chat a number of questions and comments. I'm just going to fly through them. Most of them are comments, but there are a few questions. So anyone can just follow through the comments on their own, but I'll just highlight what I see as the important ones that we can hit and ask our panelists. Well, the first question came from Tony. He asked about the footprint of Bridgetown. I dropped a link about the original World Heritage UNESCO map of Bridgetown that anyone can click on and download, but we also have PGDip draft 2017 that's on the town planning's website. Anyone can go and download those PDFs as well and have a look. So there's lots of Bridgetown there. I think our focus mainly was the city center, which is more the northern part of the UNESCO Bridgetown and Garrison World Heritage Site. But nevertheless, it's useful information. Christian Marshall had a comment, a question rather. He had a comment and a concern about the old NIS building. He thought that there might have been an opportunity missed to redevelop that for residential and entertainment. And his question, I guess, I don't think it necessarily has an answer in this forum, but is government committed to revitalizing Bridgetown? His point being that might have been an opportunity to start the process on that site. Lots of congrats on Kelly's presentation, well done. On Hayden's, there was a question from Peter Thompson. He asked, have city center real estate prices declined to match economic distress? So I would like to point Hayden, or that was when Hayden was chatting, so maybe that's the right person to answer it. Hayden?
Yeah, hearing me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, our experience is that what happens is the first thing that changes is volume is the leading indicator, and the values follow the volume. So as you would expect, the volume of tenancy declines first, and then eventually you have too much supply, and then that begins to impact price. And I think the implied answer has to be absolutely yes, Peter, because you and I could agree that if you were looking for a 10% yield on a building in Bridgetown today, maybe to the same example, you're going to just take a view of what the current income statement looks like, and you're going to make some adjustments and some assumptions, and then you're going to capitalize that at what your desired return is. So with increased stabilized vacancy and lower rents, logic would follow, yes, that values would have declined. Whether or not they have been monetized with sales at this point is perhaps a different question. But I think you're going to see that. I think it's just plausible and logical, and we shouldn't try to sugarcoat it.
All right, thank you, Hayden. Peter also mentioned that he thought that Hyatt was an epic mistake. Cherita then came on, and there were a couple comments and questions there. Barney Gibbs mentioned the trailway and suggested it would be great to bring that all the way into Fairchild Street so that there could be a trailway connection from Bridgetown out into the countryside. And that would be not only for commuting, but for recreational cycling and walking and what have you. Georgina Callender asked if we could get copies of these presentations. Kim, do you know the answer to that? Are we going to post them on our website?
I think we can do.
If people are happy.
If people are happy with that, we can certainly do so. I'll just check with each of the speakers before committing.
Right. So the answer to that is we are going to, whoever makes them available, we will post them on the Town Planning's website, the Town Plan Society's website, and we will do that probably within the next day or two. Okay. Moving on. Some good comments. Barney thought that there were excellent examples that were given by Cherita. Vicky was keen on reusing. We have so many historic buildings that are just sitting there doing nothing. I think she was keen to that. She figured we had a good start with those if we were going into reuse. Jamelia Haynes, did comment that she thought it was when government buildings were moving out of Bridgetown that certainly added to the decline, and she's right. Because people no longer had as much reason to go into Bridgetown. Barney again suggested that tertiary education and housing could be a real catalyst, and thought that was a good point, Cherita. And in general, I think everyone has been very excited about these presentations, and I've seen nothing but great comments. I see one or two more here. Peter Thompson mentioned the welcome stamp could transform Bridgetown, and no reason we couldn't build rental accommodation for 2,000 households of welcome stampers. Hopefully that opportunity for Barbados is still there and things aren't changing with COVID vaccines, but time will tell. And other than that, I think that was a wrap. Everyone was very happy. Congrats.
Right, Andy, thank you very much. Thanks for keeping an eye on that. And it's great to see such positive reactions from the vast majority, if not everybody. One thing I wanted to do before we finished was to give each of the speakers a very brief slot to say one message they hope that everybody can take away from the session. So it's one sentence from each of them. And I don't know if Joy can get everybody's face up at the same time, and we can start off with Kelly, if that's possible.
My comment would certainly be that Bridgetown is for everybody. In a nutshell, right. Bridgetown is and can be and must be for everybody.
Great, thank you. And Hayden, have you got a brief message for people to take away?
Yeah, I think I would say the time is now for residential.
Excellent, thank you. And Cherita, finally from you.
Essentially, I would just say, look, we have control over the narrative. We have the power of the pen and how the story finishes. So let's fight against the descriptive words that Kelly put out there that still have me traumatized. and we can turn things around. We can certainly do it.
Right, thank you very much. All that remains for me to do is to say a few thank yous. And the obvious one is to thank all three of the presenters for excellent presentations, which were as stimulating as I expected them to be when I saw the original PowerPoints. So thank you all very much indeed. I want to thank Andy for fielding the questions, and particularly our team who work on these events but don't get to the front. That's Jason and Jason, Georgina and Sandy, who do both the conceptual work on these sessions, but also the technical work, without which I would certainly be lost. So thank you very much to them. There will be more webinars from Barbados Town Planning Society, I'm sure. And as I said before, I think there's a cue to what the next one might be about, which is about the livability of Bridgetown, which is something which feeds into a lot of the criticisms of how things are now and what need to be done to knock over the barriers to get residential development happening and other sorts of development as well. So I think that might be the next one that comes up. I thank everybody for their presentations again, everybody who's helped, and particularly everybody who's attended. I hope you've enjoyed the session as much as we have. Thank you.